director at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. It is a law and policy think tank in New Delhi. He is an alumnus of National Law School of India, University, Bangalore, and the University of Oxford, where he was a Identification Authority of India, which oversees the Aadhaar project and more. मतलब जितने भी आधार कार्ड हमारी जेब में हैं उनमें एक बहुत बड़ा कंट्रीब्यूशन उसके कंस्ट्रक्शन में इनका रहा है. Moving on, we have as the moderator
Professor. Actually, you missed the most important part, which is that I'm a student of Professor Vijay Kumar.
Oh wow. सर जो होता है अच्छे के लिए होता है, ये बात आपके थ्रू आई है, ज़्यादा अच्छा लगा लोगों को. And moving ahead with the introduction of Professor Dr. Vijay Kumar. He is the Vice Chancellor of National Law Institute, University, Bhopal. He was appointed as Assistant Professor of Law in 1988, as Associate Professor in 1992, and Professor of Law in 1997. Prior to joining NLSIU, he was teaching at the Presidency College, Madras. He was the registrar of NLSIU between 2005 and 2008. He administered the UNHCR chair on refugee law between 1997 and April 2018, and I'm sure this conversation is going to be worth a listen. So please let them initiate, let them start with a round of applause, everyone.
Thanks very much, Siddharth, for that rousing introduction. I think following three foreign policy strategists is always a hard act to follow, given the breadth and range of the topics that we are going to talk about, that they've spoken about. But having said that, our Supreme Court, particularly of late, is no less exciting. And so I hope that we'll be able to follow that act. The book that I've written, and I won't speak very much on it, has a rather boring title because it was my PhD thesis, and so it's called Independence and Accountability of the Indian Higher Judiciary. But what I think I would have liked to call it is Lions on the Throne, because I think the Supreme Court of India is currently very close, if not lions on the throne, and the throne being the Constitution. Because as I've always said, and including in the most recent CAA and RC debates, that the Constitution doesn't give us right answers. The Constitution is a piece of text that has to be interpreted, and the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. And given the fact that the Supreme Court is immensely powerful in today's day and age, and they are doing everything from making sure there are no diesel taxis in Delhi to running cricket administration in the country and ensuring whether there should be watering of pitches in Nagpur for IPL matches during a drought. So there's really no area of life that the Supreme Court doesn't play a role in. But given the amount of power that they wield, as in my argument in this book is that there are inadequate accountability mechanisms that have developed. People really don't understand what the Supreme Court is doing often. And if I were to take a very recent example, as just the order yesterday regarding the internet shutdowns in Kashmir, and I briefly spoke to about 5 people, non-lawyers, as to what they understood. And the fact is, no one's clear as to whether it is said that the internet shutdown is legal or illegal, whether the internet is now going to be restored in Kashmir or not. So there is a mismatch between the power that the Supreme Court wields and the accountability mechanisms that are in place. And this mismatch is, in my view, because of the fact that we have an idea of judicial independence, which means insulation from the government. And this has built up over time, primarily started with Indira Gandhi during the emergency, and that fateful day before the emergency, actually on the 24th and 25th of April 1973, the day after the landmark Keshwanand Bharati judgment, when the 3 senior most judges, Justices Shelat, Grover and Hegde, were superseded, and the 4th senior most judge, Justice Ray, was made the Chief Justice of India. From that time onwards, right up to the NJSC, through the last 4 decades, there has been a view that the independence of the judiciary means the insulation of the judiciary from the government. And I argue, little provocatively, and I hope we'll get into a discussion on this, that if we want to have a judicial system that is both independent as well as accountable, and sticks to the role, and that's lions under the throne and not lions on the throne, then what we essentially need is a checks and balances scheme. We need to have the government and parliament play a critical part in any appointments process. I know particularly in this day and age, this may seem provocative, but I'm happy to discuss with Professor Vijay Kumar and in questions as to why I think that for the future of the judiciary and particularly judicial appointments in this country, there needs to be not only the collegium of judges, which is appointing judges, which for all practical purposes determines appointments of judges, but also other stakeholders, much like the NJAC tried to do. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much. I thought he would stop questioning us in the classroom. So he's following it up with this wonderful topic. As he rightly pointed out, right from the beginning, whether the court was totally free or not, nobody knows. I just want every one of you to just keep one point in mind. With 1.3 billion people in this country, how many people have possibly seen the text of the Indian Constitution is anybody's guess. Out of that, maybe less than 1%. How many of them would have read it once at least in their lifetime, including everyone in the legal field, starting from a law student, a researcher, a teacher, maybe a professional like me, the registrar and vice chancellor of the law schools, the judges, the lawyers, including the Chief Justice of India, whether they have gone through the text once in detail. Because when they sit in the court, they just look at one particular article, try to explain that article in detail, but without relating it to the other provisions of the Constitution. And therefore, a large or vast majority of this country possibly are ignorant about the provisions of the Constitution. Of course, in the last few days, we would have seen everyone is taking the preamble of the Constitution and reading it loud. But apart from that, it is not only the preamble. There is, in my opinion, I think I have shared it with R.K. Sengupta and his classmates and batches one after the other. The Indian Constitution is one among the best written constitutions in the world. I can say it because I have taught comparative constitutional law for a longer period, and it is not complete. The sentence you have to complete, one among the best written, but one among the worst implemented constitutions in the world. Because there is a wide gap between what is written and what is being practiced. And today when we are talking about the independence of judiciary, I think the same rule applies here as well. So there is a wide gap between what is being written, what is being practiced, and if I have to add one more interesting aspect, what was deliberated, discussed, and finalized in the Constituent Assembly. So their vision about how the judiciary should be, and then what they have translated in the form of provisions of the Constitution, and today how these provisions are being eroded by the practices just by giving some judgments here and there. So therefore it is a wonderful opportunity for a common man, a citizen of this country, to understand how this judiciary is functioning in the country today, whether it is independent, and if it is independent, is it accountable. Just to make few observations as foundational principles, I would consider the independence of the court consisting of three different phases. The first phase, the independence of the judges before somebody is appointed, and that is the job of somebody to look up for such individuals. The second phase that I look up is the independence while they are serving as the judges of this court, either the High Court or the Supreme Court. And the third stage, which probably is not included in the text, except only one provision, if I can recall, 124 clause 7, that they cannot practice in any other courts, right? They cannot take up any other position, except that there is absolutely no mention about the status of these independent judges, what I call it as post-retirement stage. So the moment somebody is a Chief Justice, and today he retires, and he is not wanted anywhere. and he gets into oblivion. Of course, nobody gets into oblivion today. Almost all the retiring judges, they look forward to the retirement because there is a lot of arbitration taking place in this world. So they're all behind arbitration. So therefore, we have to look at these three stages: prior to, during, and post-retrial, whether the judges have been independent. And collectively, if they are independent, then with some guarantee we can say the institution, that is the judiciary, itself is also independent. Maybe one or two aberrations here and there will certainly be there because we are all human beings. We can commit errors at any point of time, whether it is American Supreme Court or whether it is the Indian Supreme Court. They may commit a few blunders, few mistakes here and there, but I think consistently it is their job ultimately under the Constitution to safeguard the provisions of the Constitution, the way it is written, the way it is developed, and tune it according to the developments that is taking place in the world today. The one Aragya just now mentioned, how far the internet is part and parcel of the freedom of speech and expression. I'll stop here.
No, I think just picking up on a couple of points that Professor Vijay Kumar mentioned, I think as a former law minister, very tongue-in-cheek said about the question of post-retirement. He said that there are two kinds of judges. There are forward-looking judges and judges who are looking forward. And I think this is actually one of the key areas that is not looked at. And one of the things that I looked at in the book is particularly in regard to statistics of Supreme Court judges who are appointed in post-retirement positions by the government. Arbitration is one story. We know that arbitration, most of you here who are from the legal fraternity will know that arbitration is a very rewarding option for judges post-retirement. But my research showed that about 70% of judges in the sample size that I had taken have at least one post-retirement job from the government. And this is not to blame the government or the judges, it's also because our system of tribunals and commissions are such that a lot of them, whether it be the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal or it be the TDSAT, they all require judges of the Supreme Court to be appointed. But I think that this, even more than judicial appointments, in my view, is the key concern if we want an independent judiciary. Because this goes back to what Justice Krishna Iyer had said, and I quoted in my book because I thought this was interesting. Because he said, during the careers of judges, many carrots are held out to deflect judicial performance from the path of rectitude. Judicial afternoons and evenings are sensitive phases. The incumbent being bothered about post-retirement prospects. The executive plays upon this weakness to bend the integrity or buy the partiality of elderly brethren. Because this is something that actually we have seen particularly grow over time. And this is an issue that governments across party lines have shown a propensity towards. And I think that post-retirement employment is something that the constitution framers, if we go back to what Professor Vijay Kumar was saying in the original debates in the Constituent Assembly, they could never imagine something like this being an issue. That's why the only provision they put in is that they can't go back to practice in the bar. But that they would take up appointments by the government, it was felt that these are persons of the highest integrity. There is no question of laying down what they can or cannot do post-retirement. But given, and I think this is the key point that I would like to stress on, and I'd really like to hear your views on it. I think what has happened over the course of the last 70 years has been a steady expansion of judicial power. And particularly in the last 20 years, given the growth of the internet and given the availability in the last 10 years of social media where everybody has an opinion, the judiciary is always on the front pages of the newspapers. And given that, I think that the systems of the judiciary, its appointment mechanisms, the way in which it conducts its affairs have still remained stuck in time. So I think it's this mismatch that you have a court which is ruling, and if you just take the last year, as in the court, what we do know, and this is just a simple example, we do know the fact that the court heard and decided the Ayodhya dispute that had gone on for 70 years. The court is currently hearing the constitutionality of Article 370. And the court will hear the constitutionality of the CAA NRC. Now this is what we do know as citizens. What perhaps many may not know is that in this last year, there have been 8 judges who have been appointed to the Supreme Court, 2 of whom will go on to become Chief Justice of India, Justices Suryakant and Gawai, and besides that, these are names that may not be familiar to everybody. Justice Bose, Justice Bopanna, Justice Murari, Justice Ramasubramanian, Justice Bhatt, Justice Roy. Now these are not names familiar to everybody, but these people, 2 of these people are judges of the Supreme Court. They will be deciding the issues that I spoke about. And then there is a third category of things that we know that something is happening, but perhaps we don't understand it fully. Like, why do certain cases get listed? Or why do other cases not get listed? Let's take an example. There was a huge hue and cry that the Aadhaar matter was not listed for a very long time. But let's give an even more stark example. There is a case pending from 2011 on the constitutionality of the breakup of Andhra Pradesh into Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. Now, anybody in the audience, including someone who is not well versed with the law at all, will be able to tell you that the Supreme Court will not be able to set the clock back now. Even if it rules that it cannot rule. I think it's just simply an impossibility, except in a theoretical sense, that the Supreme Court will now say that the formation of Telangana was unconstitutional. So, there are these things that are happening that we don't quite understand. And all of it, in my view, comes from the fact that there is much greater interest in the Supreme Court today. I think even 10 years back, Professor Vijay Kumar, as a session on the Supreme Court, we wouldn't even have a quarter of the audience that we have here today. It was still seen as the business of lawyers and things that people don't understand. But I think people are interested in the court. The court matters to everybody, but we don't understand the court. And that's why I argue in my book that we do need to think about a court for the 21st century that opens itself up much more to public scrutiny and, more importantly, to public understanding.
Right. I think a couple of things before I respond to some of these questions that you raised. As we proceed to look at the first one, I said the selection of judges. Who selects them? Who appoints them? It's a $1 million question because nobody knows who does it finally. All figures point out to one particular man, which is not even mentioned in the Constitution of India. So therefore, it is a tricky business, so let me not get into the riddle of who is appointed, how they are being selected. In fact, I would like to just quote one statement of mine. In 2005, there was a national conference on judicial appointments, organized by the National Law University of Odisha. There were a few judges sitting and retired judges who were present there. And I was telling that even after 55 years, because it happened in 2005, I was mentioning that even after 55 years, we have not translated the spirit of the Constitution in identifying a man or a woman, allowing that man or woman to decide the cases according to what the Constitution and the law says. We are always looking at caste, religion, this, that, state-wise quota, that quota, this quota. I think we are mired with all conflicts. And ultimately we lose what you call as the main important purpose of the court, the judges who are supposed to sit and decide cases beyond all these parameters. We don't want to look at which state you belong to. We don't want to look at the dress and say that one is right or one is wrong. And therefore we are not able to identify that cream of citizens of this country who are qualified to be appointed, and therefore I still doubt whether the process is transparent, is good. I have my own reservation on that. Having said that, I used to tell the students at the law school in Bangalore when I was teaching there, I love teaching because we had a wonderful team of 3 teachers going and taking different sides and arguing. So I used to tell them, if you want to do real research on the judiciary, please take the life of a judge in the Supreme Court. Maybe it is for 6 years, 7 years or 9 years, and divide that into three phases. Or a High Court judge, divide that period which he serves as a judge or she serves as a judge into 3 periods. The first period, first 1/3, the judge is able to get into the system and do something good, or he is able to do something different, right? You will see in many judgments, this is my general assessment. I don't have statistics like Arigya, I'm not a researcher. I'm only a teacher. So I would rather say that 3 years, the first 1/3 of the point, everyone happens to be a wonderful judge, right? There may be exceptions to every rule, but I think everyone happens to, or everyone tends to be wonderful judges. The second phase starts what you call as a balancing phase, because as I told you, the post-retirement benefits. So that is what comes into their mind, and possibly they mellow down a little during the second phase. And final phase, if somebody does the research, you will be not surprised, because they will be pro-government, pro-state, that type of attitude. Is it good? Is it bad? I would rather consider this, if you are not a lawyer, if you are not a law student, I want you to carry this question in your mind. If I have to allow these judges to act independently, I have to allow them to function independently. And that is given in the Constitution. But rest is not provided in the Constitution. For example, a police inspector or a sub-inspector in 1950, at the commencement of the Constitution, maybe his salary was about 80 rupees. Monthly salary was about 80 rupees or 100 rupees. And then today, you just look at the salary of the sub-inspector. I think it must be around 8,000 rupees or 10,000 rupees per month. But much, maybe more. So you see the transformation from 100 rupees per month in 1950 to tens and thousands of rupees in 2020. Please look at the salary of the judges. It was fixed in the Constitution earlier, got amended twice, right, in between, whenever the government wanted to. The salary of the judge at that point of time, the Supreme Court judge, was around 4,000 rupees per month, and 4,500 rupees for the Chief Justice of India per month. Plus all other building was assessed, whatever they were giving them. So you can see the sub-inspector was drawing 100 rupees, and see as a judge of the Supreme Court, 40 times higher than the salary of a sub-inspector. Do the judges today get 40 times more than what the sub-inspector is getting today? And if you are not able to provide this, and then look at it, when you retire and get out of the bungalow that is given to you in Delhi, possibly you may not find a peaceful, 3-bedroom apartment in Delhi. And that's the place where Justice Verma stayed, So there are wonderful examples who could not stay in their own bungalows, so they have to finally rent out the building. So how do you think that these people can survive the system, make their feelings, to the family, their obligations, because everyone asks the question, are you settled in life? What is meant by settlement in life? Do you have a bungalow? Do you have a car? These are the things that people look for socially. And that type of settlement possibly may not be possible for such judges if they are honest and sincere. Therefore, we need to look at these conditions, service conditions, and then comes into picture, R.K. Sengupta was arguing possibly in favor of those judges getting appointed in various governmental jobs, statutory positions. We have been arguing in the classroom also that it is against the spirit of the Constitution. I would like to just remind all of you present here that when the Constitution was being drafted, one argument was, let them retire at the age of 65, but continue to draw the full salary when they were looking at Article 124, Class 7, that they should not undertake any other position, nor practice anywhere in the country. So they said, let them continue to draw the full salary as they retire, but whenever the government needs their services, they can take them for consultation. See what a sophisticated way of looking at it. And instead, now everyone is aligning oneself to look for some position in a statutory corporation or a statutory authority. So therefore, that independence is still a big question, for me, whether that independence continues to remain today or not. Because with a large number of authorities coming into picture, there is no dearth of appointments. But I would agree, the Constitution does not prohibit a High Court judge or a High Court Chief Justice from taking up such positions. Probably the Parliament would have amended the law or made the law in such a manner that no Supreme Court judge is appointed to those positions, but they will appoint the retired Chief Justices of a High Court to such a position. Possibly things would have been a little better. This is only theoretical. But how the judges in the Supreme Court itself will visualize this is a different question. So independence is that one. So beginning we don't know. In the service conditions we don't know the 3 stages I mentioned to you. Post-retirement benefit, I think these are all the issues. So I have my own doubt in a democratic country like ours, the independence still continues to remain. But I hope a large majority of the populace in this country, they do believe that the judiciary has lots of power and therefore they have the independence. And rightfully so, because this is the last resort in a democracy. If anything happens, ultimately you knock on the doors of the court. And once the court seals the issue as final, people also understand and keep quiet.
And I think that that's actually a very valid point that we can, and in the book also, as I have some, as Mr. Vijay Kumar was saying, that there's some constructive criticism of the judiciary and some of its practices. But the fact remains that even though this might be sort of diminishing, maybe marginally, that the judiciary is still the most trusted of the 3 organs of government. Now, that has, in my view, that has a lot to do with the failings of the other organs, but it has also a lot to do with the hoary legacy of the judiciary itself. As we have men and women of fine caliber who have graced the portals of the Supreme Court. And I think that what has happened over the course of the last 20 odd years particularly is the fact, and this relates to something that he was saying, which is that given the importance of jobs post-retirement, given the importance of the fact that the judges are retiring at 65 and they are more than capable of serving for a few more years on the Supreme Court or as judges. And so I've argued in my book that the first thing we should do is that we should increase the retirement age to the age of 70 or at least 68 across the board. And number 2, equalize the retirement age of High Court judges and Supreme Court judges. Initially, the retirement age was fixed as 60 originally, which later became 62 for High Court judges and 65 for Supreme Court judges, because it was felt that no High Court judge would come to Delhi because of the fact that no one, as in Justice Chagla in Bombay and Justice Raja Bannar in Chennai, had refused to serve on the first Supreme Court. So they gave the additional 3 years as an incentive. Now that actually 70 years down the line sounds laughable when High Court judges are waiting at airports for Supreme Court judges to come. So the fact is everybody wants to go to the Supreme Court now, and that's the way in which that system has evolved. And given the fact that this progression in the career and the need for, as he rightly said, as in some basic sustenance post retirement, because the pension is still only half drawn of the last salary. Given that need, the fact is that I think, and this is my hypothesis, that a lot of what we see in the newspapers in terms of judges making fantastic statements, the fact that everyone's on the front page, as in the Supreme Court or even High Courts are on the front pages on a very regular basis, partly is of course media sensationalization, that is across the board, but partly is also because of the fact that it's important from a very human point of view for judges to want to be prominent, as people want to be known. And earlier it was felt that judges will only speak through their judgments, and I think that that's certainly no longer the case. And in a recent conversation with 3 judges of the Madras High Court, they said that they were thinking about a resolution that they would move in the Madras High Court that no individual names of judges should appear in newspapers. And they said that if you stop these individual names of judges appearing in newspapers, you will immediately see this sensationalization dropping. That judges will not make these kinds of statements that are often made, because a lot of it is oral observation in court. So I think this all comes back to the main point, that today we have a court which is hearing the most momentous issues of our time. And irrespective of the fact that some of these may not be judicial issues, like cricket administration in the country is not a judicial issue in my view, and the Supreme Court just should not get into that kind of issue at all. As in, if the BCCI has to go to the dogs, let it go to the dogs, it will find its own way out. It has so much money in the organization, it will find its own way. But the fact is that we live in times which are where there are serious questions about the beautiful constitution that he mentioned, perpetuating in the form in which the framers intended it to be. There are several questions that the Supreme Court has to answer and has had to answer for a period of time, as in ranging from Kashmir now to the CAA and going back as in defection, and there are several questions that the Supreme Court has to answer. I think it's critical that if the Supreme Court is to continue to keep the public confidence, because at the end of the day, it's really the legitimacy of the court comes from the fact that still, if we do a show of hands in this auditorium, I am confident that most people will still trust the Supreme Court more than the other organs of government. And given that that's the case, the Supreme Court has to keep that public confidence, that the Supreme Court has to be better understood by the people, and to be better understood by the people, and maybe I have a slight disagreement with Professor Vijay Kumar there needs to be some optimal transparency in its appointments. I think the debate on appointments in India has been for too long as to whether the government should appoint, as was the case in the first 40 years, whether collegium should appoint or whether the NJAC should appoint. For the record, I am a supporter of the NJAC, but the fact is that beyond the point, the question is not about who appoints. The question is really about the process that is followed for appointment, and who is this caliber of person that he rightly said we are appointing. Because irrespective of who is appointing the judges, the fact is that I think as citizens of the country, we have a right to know, there should be some basic criterion. As he said, is caste a criterion for appointment? Is religion a criterion for appointment? We often hear that there should be one Muslim judge in the court. We say that, for so long there has been no scheduled caste judge. We had seen that in the case of the elevation of Justice K.M. Joseph, there was an argument that was put that Kerala has 2 judges. But is there a norm anywhere that Kerala should have 1 judge? Should every state have 1 judge? If that's the case, then why does Bombay High Court have 4 judges currently in the Supreme Court? So, these are all questions that people have. And I think that these questions require answering, and that is really the process that is followed. Publish, and as I said, publish some criteria on the basis of which appointments can take place. Make sure that those criteria are followed, and after a period of time, not immediately, after a period of time, make sure that it can become public. And I think that there is no escaping from transparency in today's day and age. The Supreme Court gives great judgments on transparency, and I welcome those. And I think it's also time that it, walk the talk in that sense.
I think I have to agree with him when he stated that transparency, yes, of course, but when it is to be released to the public is a very good position that you have taken after some times. Because the moment you release that I am going to appoint R.K. Sengupta as the judge of the Madhya Pradesh High Court, let me tell you, there are anonymous petitions which come up to the court, one after the other, that he is a terrorist, he is that, he is this, and for this reason, the inquiry by the department, by others, it takes lots of time. Anyhow, that I think is a wonderful opportunity for us to look at whether these things to be released and what is the best way of choosing them. These are all things in a dynamic, fluid manner. I think somewhere it will fructify. I still do not agree with him because it is a talk between the teacher and the taught. So he has the freedom to think whatever he wants, and I have the right to say that he is wrong. Right? So therefore, whether NJAC should be the deciding authority, I would rather say no, a big no. Right? Ultimately, that also has a politician there, and I think the moment you put a politician there, the judiciary's respect will also go in some form or the other. So anyhow, that's a different story. Coming back to this concept of independence, I spoke about the independence within the judiciary in 3 phases, but that is only internal mechanism, the independence of the judiciary itself. But there is an externality also. There must be a check, which R.K. Sengupta initially made a remark, that unless and otherwise there is a check on the authority of the court will think that it has all the powers in the world and it can do anything it wants. Right? Therefore, some of the judges, right from the US Federal Supreme Court, judges declare what the law is. We say what the law is through our judgments. So therefore, if it gets into their mind that I dictate whatever as law, I think that is too dangerous. So therefore, there must be a proper check, and that check has not been functional in this country for whatever reason. If time permits, I would like to take a couple of examples. The checks and balances depends upon a concept called as separation of powers. That there are 3 branches of the government: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Now they are all co-equal. We say co-equal, but as a lawyer and a law teacher, I would rather say the Supreme Court is a little shade better than the other 2. Why shade better? Because the Constitution says so. ultimately whatever the executive does or the legislature does, there is a final watchman, the last watchman, and that last watchman of the constitution is the Supreme Court or the High Court in the States. And therefore, anything that happens, they have slightly higher pedestal, they stand in higher pedestal in declaring a law made by the parliament as unconstitutional, or the amendments made to the constitution by the parliament as unconstitutional, or any executive action as unconstitutional. So it tends to enjoy a little bit more power. And once the power is there, Lord Acton was absolutely right, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And once they enjoy that, then there must be somebody to tell them, please, this is your limit, get back to your limits. Therefore, that democratic weapon of checks and balances is yet to take place in this country. So far, the constitution is very brilliantly drafted on this. But of course, the judges in the first 2 decades very clearly said we don't have separation of powers at all in the constitution. They buried it. And therefore, one authority took the control, and then the judiciary became a little subservient. And then what happened in 70s, I think Arghya very clearly mentioned that. Then now in the 90s, the court wanted to come back, spring back to what you call it as a position of what you call it as number uno. And therefore the court is trying to do everything. This check, what I am thinking, what I am saying, what I am planning to express here is that the Supreme Court, whenever it commits blunder, not the court but an individual judge, there is a world of difference between these two. The Supreme Court as an institution is one, the individual judges as another. They all occupy. 31 judges or 34 judges now, they will all occupy, they will constitute the court, final court. But the Supreme Court cannot commit any blunder because it has no body, no soul, it is not a living organ. But the judges, the Constitution very clearly prescribes that a judge of the Supreme Court or the High Court possibly can be removed from the court individually if there is proved misbehavior or incapacity. These are the 2 concepts given. On no other ground you can remove a judge. And this was a wonderful weapon in the hands of the parliament. They could have done something, but they did not do. That is the place where the party politics come into picture, and it gets thoroughly diluted. I would like to just recollect what happened in the 90s, early 90s, when there was a move to impeach. I'm sorry, I should not be using the term impeachment, because no judge of the court can be impeached. Only the President of India can be impeached. All others can only be removed from the office. There is a world of difference between these two. And when there was an opportunity created for the Parliament to remove Justice V. Ramaswamy from office, I think the first phase of it, the matter going to the court more frequently by him, by his wife, by his nephew, right? And then the way that the judiciary itself was fighting, that if you just put somebody as a committee member, I will disclose everything about him, brought lots of bad elements about the court and its ability to manage. And ultimately what happened was, when all these 14 charges were proved by a committee constituted according to the law passed by the Parliament itself, somehow the Parliament put it in such a manner that the resolution was not carried with the 2/3 majority. I don't want to speak about which party did this or which party did not do that, but
all that is there in my book.
it's there in your book.
Yeah.
Oh, then you can speak about that.
Sir, actually, I'm extremely sorry. I would like to interrupt you because, with your permission, I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. So, if anyone happens to ask, yes, Deepak, please get the gentleman in front of me.
Whatever term you want to use, specifically in the US, which I believe moved with the spoiled system, and it is, I mean, that's what.
But for the higher judiciary, as in for the Supreme Court, as in the US, as it follows a completely different system. And I think the theoretical understanding of this is beautifully provided by James Madison, the 4th President of the US, who said that separation of powers in the US is a system by which ambition must counteract ambition. And for the judiciary, it means that in the US, first the nomination of any judge of the Supreme Court is by the President, so that is the executive branch, and there is a ratification by the Senate, which is the legislative branch. which is why in the US the appointees are known to be political appointees, but any fear that they will decide politically according to the text of the constitution is sought to be offset by the fact that they have life tenure. So they can serve till the rest of their lives. So nobody can, so there is no threat of removing and there is no threat of this post-retirement appointment that might take place. So the US is a system where we know that some judge is a Republican judge or some judge is a Democratic judge, which is very different from the system in India, but that is the way checks and balances operates in the US. Say the UK, for example, which is a little bit different and has changed its system over the in 2005. Earlier, as in actually, this is, we can get into a theoretical debate about Montesquieu, but we don't want to do that here. But the fact is that in the UK, Parliament is sovereign. And so everything, all power resides in the sovereign. But what they did in 2005 is that they set up a Supreme Court Selection Commission, like the NJAC, for appointment of judges, which had members of the government as well as the judiciary. And they had the power to appoint judges. And the court also, for the first time in the UK, had the power to declare legislation incompatible, because the UK you can't strike down legislation as you do here. So there are different systems. We need to find a system that is culturally suitable for us.
Okay.
Yeah, it goes outside the provisions of the constitution. The legislature can address that. The impeachment that now impending impeachment is one such process. A check on the executive power. The president may appoint the judge, but the power to remove the judge is in the hands of the legislature, the two houses put together. So therefore, no one feels that one is superior to the other. And when somebody goes beyond the limits of the constitution, somebody is always there to nudge them, please get back to your domain, don't go beyond. And if you still do something, then there is a provision which takes care of to tell them that what they have done is wrong.
So, isn't it too much to expect independence and accountability of the higher judiciary without addressing the malice in the other two organs of the constitution, that is executive and executive and legislature? Unless we address the ills that is afflicting these two organs, isn't it too much to expect judges to suddenly become honest and expecting probity in the judiciary? So this has to go along with judiciary, with the legislature and executive. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a knife from Mars.
Well, they don't come from Venus also. There are no women judges as well.
Right? You may ask the question why the other two departments, unless and unless the other two branches are corrected, you cannot expect a good judge to come forward. I would not like to agree with that because, as I mentioned to you, the constitution protects the judges, not the Prime Minister, not the President. It protects the judges to the extent that whatever judgment they give, even if it goes against the government, they just can't do anything. And that is the type of power they enjoy. During the tenure, their salary cannot be reduced. They cannot be whimsically removed from office except on these two grounds. And you have seen in the three cases that so far we have taken, none of them came through. So therefore it is very difficult for the other two branches joined together, even in removing them. And therefore, expecting them to be independent is not an issue of high order. It is a constitutional mandate. If somebody is not willing to act according to that, I think he or she is not fit to be in the court, constitutional court, that is the High Court of the Supreme Court.
And please keep the question precise.
My name is Amit Pratap Singh. I'm faculty under sir. We expect and we treat Supreme Court as a custodian of the Constitution. They're expected to be like the custodian of the fundamental rights as well, and ours right as well. Now when we see the judges going to the press conferences and pleading for their right, point number one. And then second, when some of the judges are landing into these memorial lectures every point of time and making certain very provocative and I would not say rather scandalous, but provocative points which might be part of some of the pending cases. So how both the point you see when they are expected to be the custodian of our rights?
So I think that On the press conference, this is actually a little complicated issue. So you'll have to. There's a full chapter dedicated to the press conference, which was after the thesis, the epilogue. So I'm not going to get into that issue there. But on this question of memorial lectures, I think it's a very well settled convention that judges should let the judgment speak for themselves. Number one. So whether they're giving a memorial, if they're giving a memorial lecture, it should not be defending their own judgment, because that. The judge is functus officio, the judgment is written, and after that you don't defend your own judgment as in an open forum. This is a very well established convention. And secondly, as far as pending cases are concerned, I think that this would be a case of judicial impropriety if a judge is making a statement or revealing his or her mind about something that is going to come up or is likely to come up. If, however, that happens, and there have been several instances in the past that it has happened, then I think if the matter is listed before that judge, the judge must recuse himself or herself from that matter, because the core reason as to why people in this auditorium today still will say that the judiciary is the most trusted organ is because we trust them to be impartial. And the moment you lose that, and it has come under strain, and it always, in history, it always comes under strain when you have majoritarian governments. When you have strong majority governments, everyone thinks, whether rightly or wrongly, they think that the judiciary is under their thumb. And we know that it was said about the press and the judiciary during the emergency that they were merely asked to bend, but they crawled, right? So the fact of the matter is that for judges, they must have the individual propriety to not speak on matters that might come up in court before them. And if it has happened, as it might happen, then they should not hear the matter as a judge.
Just to add something, though he has put everything in the book, for the benefit of people who have not, even I have not read the book in full, so I can, whether they can go to the press is an issue. And what happened last year, when 4 judges went to the press, saying whatever they have to say, I don't want to repeat that. Is it appropriate? Is it proper? Is it constitutional? Is it valid? Is it legal? These are all the questions everyone asks. I would like to just bring to your notice, there is something called as a code on judicial ethics. And there are about 27 points in judicial ethics. Judicial ethics is not legislated by the parliament. It is not given by anybody. It is given by the judges themselves for themselves. Right? There is a code on judicial ethics. Out of these 27 points of judicial ethics which they said they will not do, they will not indulge, there are 2 judicial ethics which very clearly mention they will not go to the press conference. So when I go to the class and teach, because this is a free forum, so I could express my views. So therefore, if somebody goes and does something, the code on judicial ethics is what you have enacted for yourselves. You have drawn those codes for yourselves, for your behavior. And once you have done that, I think you should be automatically brought under the phrase misbehavior. And then, if the legislature was strong enough to do that, possibly they could have done that, but they did not do it. See, these are all politically mired. Why should they do it? I may, as an academic, I want them to do. But politically, they may not like to do. These are 2 different aspects. But the fact remains, if they have violated the code of ethics, which they themselves have drafted, I think proved misbehavior, I would like to just bring to the audience notice, proved misbehavior is not the proof the criminal law or criminal jurisprudence wants us to prove. Proved everything beyond reasonable doubt.
Definitely,
Right?
sir.
It is at the lowest level of proof.
Yes.
If it is there, it is wonderful.
And with this, we will just take the last question, and really the last question. Please keep it very short and precise.
ऑनरेबल दीपक मिश्रा जी जब जज थे, चीफ जस्टिस CJI थे, एक डिसीजन लिया गया था लेकिन गवर्नमेंट के द्वारा उसको डिसीजन को बदल दिया गया था. तो इज इट काइंड ऑफ डिसरिस्पेक्ट ऑफ जुडिशरी?
बट ये कौन सा डिसीजन के बारे में बात कर रहे हैं?
सर SC/ST एक्ट पर एक डिसीजन लिया गया.
वो दीपक मिश्रा नहीं था, वो आदर्श गोयल का एक डिसीजन. But this is part of the political process. I think that there's one question from there for a long time.
Sir,
We've been very unfair to that side, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
As in,
The last one. Because actually our guests for the next session are already here.
मुद्दों को अपने संज्ञान में लेते हुए निर्णय दे देती. तो प्राय ये सवाल उठता है, क्या न्यायपालिका कार्यपालिका के क्षेत्राधिकार का हनन कर रही है? इस विषय में आप लोगों का क्या मत है? क्या ये वास्तव में ऐसा हो रहा है या ये खाली फालतू ऐसा?
तो ये नहीं एक्चुअली वास्तव में ये हो रहा है, पर ये इशू के ऊपर निर्भर करता है. तो जैसे as if you take an environmental issue where times for the courts to step in, but when it becomes an everyday matter, as in when it's not just related to the environment but goes into matters as esoteric as cricket or building hotels somewhere or the other, so we have to see this as issue based and we can't see this as a free for all.
Okay, thank you so much, gentlemen.